Okay, good morning everybody. I'm Geert Deconinck. I'm a full professor at the University of Leuven and in Energyville, full-time researcher. Happy to be here to open up the school that we have from the SNIPPET project. I'm not going to talk about the SNIPPET project. We're going to have a session specifically on that later this week. But because there are different viewpoints to this title, Secure and Peer-to-Peer Energy Trading, we thought it might be useful to have two more generic presentations. One about security aspects, going to be the next speaker, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the grid itself and important evolutions in the grid as we see them today, the next decade, and I will also make a link to a little bit of our research work in that context. So it's entitled Decarbonized, Decentralized and Data-Driven Electricity Grids for the Next Decades. And of course, we should start from where every presentation starts, I think, the energy transition. And then talk a little bit about the research opportunities and have an outlook towards the end. And take approximately 1 hour for the whole thing. Of course, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So some of you were involved in the problem that you see on the top the day before yesterday, the torrential rain. Ongoing currently in Nigeria, major floods. Here in this country, during the summer, great wildfires. And also droughts, so that you saw on different places ships that were barely able to pass by. Weather phenomena, together with climate change and an undeniable link to anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, which basically means that we need to reduce that and mitigate that kind of change in order to keep this planet livable. And the power system plays a role in that from the perspective that it is contributing to those emissions, currently still a lot. The energy system as a whole, according to the United Nations, about 60% power system, electric power is only a part of that, of course. And this power system that we're talking about is also a critical infrastructure. A critical infrastructure, it means many societies worldwide are relying on it, are depending on it, really cannot live without it. And if the power system fails, breaks down, people can lose lives. It serves different other infrastructures and itself is dependent on other infrastructure, which basically means that's a kind of interdependencies of infrastructure. And in order to make the whole system resilient, you need to make sure how things can cascade from one to the other or can mitigate problems in one or the other. And from the power system perspective, there are three important needs that we need to take into account. You need to have electricity available on a long term and on a shorter term, the security of supply problem. You need to be able to deal with short interruptions, a line that goes out, a generating plant that goes out, N-1, N-2, that's reliability. And then you need to deal with kind of major, high impact, low probability events. Think about an earthquake, a winter storm, which can devastate a bigger part of the system and still you want to recover from that. So that's the problem of resilience. And in all of those things, data is going to play a major role in order to get security of supply, to get reliability, to get resilience. Control used to be top-down. We're seeing many more bottom-up control approaches. Also, they play a role in these three needs. At the bottom right, you see the price of electricity. Until the beginning of this year, I did not update it, but it has been rising further throughout the year. which is mainly related to the fossil fuels being used to generate electricity or for gas specifically. So we can say that the current energy crisis, mainly affecting Europe, is to a large extent a fossil fuel crisis. And if we get rid of fossil fuels, that will also ripple out. Final thing, within the European Commission, due to the geopolitical situation and the disconnection from some Russian gas, the Repower EU program wanted to replace 100 billion cubic meter of gas during 2022 from what we imported by Russia from other sources and diminishing the result, which also attributes to this kind of rising prices. But we want to get rid of those fossil fuels in order to have the energy transition mitigating the climate change, and to get rid of the fossil fuels and basically also to be geopolitically a bit more independent as European citizens. And for that, Europe has had a long time ago, we're talking the beginning of this century, 2005, set out a vision to get rid of the greenhouse gas emissions for all of the different sectors. And I have some, I'm not sure if you can hear me from the back, but you can see with respect to 2050 that we need to go to net zero. A little bit will still be generated of emissions, but we will need to capture them as well. And this brown area is the power system. And the emissions of the power system by 2040, that's only less than 20 years from now, need to be completely based on renewables. Europe started with this vision in 2005 and had a first goal set for reducing these emissions by 2020. And you can see that we met that goal. This is how the emissions with respect to the reference target 1919 went down. And by 2020, we had to decrease it by 20% with respect to the initial situation. Europe as a whole made, or the European Union as a whole, made 23%. And at the same time, they have made an economic growth of about 60%, which means that the carbon intensity of the system has gone down drastically. And so it's also a good sign. It's not because we need to reduce emissions that we go back to the Stone Age. There's still a lot of fun to be done. And greenhouse gas emission reduction is one of these three pillars from the European Union. There are two others. We still need a lot of energy. Let's have more from renewable sources. Renewable sources means that we are not depleting the Earth's resources. Think about solar, wind, geothermal, or water. And third pillar, of course, the less energy we need, the less resources we're going to spend. So like, for instance, this type of lighting system is not the most efficient one. From the perspective of energy efficiency, we could reduce that by replacing it by a better thing. Other examples include insulation for less thermal heating. And so this first column were the targets for 2020. We're now accelerating because we need to get Fit for 55. That was the European Commission Frans Timmermans' slogan for the program, to reduce the emissions with respect to the 1990 reference point by 55%. And we see the same type of goals for the renewables, more than 30%, and for less energy use, also reducing it with 30%. That is for all type of energy, electricity, heating, also the energy for transport, and so on. And the global goal is to get more or less carbon neutral by 2050. Which means that we need to change. Business as usual will not work, and we need to accelerate the rate of change. And you can ask yourself the rhetoric question, do you want to sit back in the dark? Or do you accept to reduce comfort? You don't want to travel that much anymore. Of course, it's a rhetoric question, so we don't have to ask. Or we know the answer, we don't want to do that, but still we want to reach those targets because we want to have this planet also for our children and grandchildren. Luckily, we're not on our own with Europe to get there. You all know about the Paris Climate Agreement, and the first of the 3 resolutions is well known. We want to have, by the end of the century, the increase of average temperature under 2 degrees, hopefully. But the 2 other parts of the resolution are equally important. We need to be able to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impact from climate change and to have resilience. I talked about resilience a moment ago. And that in a way which doesn't threaten food production. So we're not going to make biofuels, and so other people are going to starve out. And also we are going to make financial flows consistent with those, with a kind of idea of different and differentiated responsibilities and capacities. So the ones that have been profiting the most from now the problems should also pay most to get to the solutions. And those poor countries that are still in a developing phase and which are probably even more affected by the climate change, we should help them as a whole. Which is also part of, and I think every student needs to know about the Sustainable Development Goals. And the number 7 is really about energy, clean energy for all. It starts from setting goals by 2030, that's only 8 years from now, that we want to have universal access to affordable, reliable and modern energy services for all of the world, knowing that still nowadays 1 billion people are not connected to the electricity grid. So still a large step to make. And you see some other goals that we have there in order to get there. I wanted to talk a little bit more about these 3 Ds. So let me talk about what it brings, this decarbonized energy system, to the grid, and how our current electricity grid, which was not really smart, needs to become smarter in order to deal with that. It's the vision for many researchers that if you look to the residential or to the built environment, the way to get to those goals, to get to complete decarbonization, is twofold. First, you make all the electricity based on renewables, and then you make all the energy services depending on electricity only. Then you will have all your electricity services, all your energy services based on renewables, have without any emissions. That means heating, mobility, transport, all based on electricity as the main carrier. Making the generation from renewables, electricity is a very convenient energy carrier. You don't smell it, you can keep it in your hands, you have it in your laptops and your smartphones and so on. You can store it to some extent and these kind of things are getting better and so on. But that requires a number of changes. Changes to the grid because of this increased electrification. Making all the energy services electrical means electrification. Heating is going to be done with a heat pump, which uses electricity to bring heat from one temperature level to another. When you have a low energy building, it doesn't make sense to have a gas connection anymore. So you're going to use electricity in order to heat up the additional heat that you need. You need, of course, also in a well-insulated home ventilation or air conditioning based on electricity. And so on, for all of the different type of energy services, we are seeing electricity as a carrier. Which means that if we want to get to less primary energy use as a whole, we will have more electricity, which means we need to reinforce the grid from that perspective. Less primary energy use. Why? Well, we will not have fossil fuels anymore for driving. We will not have it for gas and so on. We will all have that electrified. But that means that from the grid perspective, and that's a kind of number where we are currently somewhere around 20% of end use of energy, which is electrical, is going to move to 33 or even 35 or to 40% according to the planning offices. So what does it mean from the grid perspective? This electrification, which is the load side of the grid. We will have to transport more electrical energy, so more electricity consumption, but also it's going to result in higher peaks. And for those of you with a background in power systems, you know that the electrical grid is dimensioned for the peaks. It is the maximal amount of current at a given voltage level that can go through a particular wire, otherwise you will have some problems. So, more electricity consumption and higher peaks. We need to generate electricity when we need it. So, from a prediction point of view, it's difficult to predict, to get there, more difficult than currently, because you have all those energy services that make use of that. But there again, we're going to make the link to the data, lots of opportunities for that. I talked about the peaks, so you need either to reinforce the grid or reinforce some parts of the grid, because it has to be dimensioned for the peak usage. And currently, the distribution grid, that means the low and medium voltage level, is not really monitored. It's a kind of fit and forget strategy. They've put the wires and the cables into the ground and they remain there. So basically, we first need to get much more view on the state, monitor those elements, and then probably also control a few elements inside the grid or at the load side, in the houses, in the companies, where we use electricity for the different services. Think about electric vehicles. If everybody would charge the electric vehicle at the same time, we would increase the evening peak, which is already the peak where there's most of electricity use. So we really need to avoid that by smoothing that out over time, and then we can use the same grid for charging the electric vehicles. But there are also the changes at the supply side. So the supply of electricity, because it's becoming less deterministic, more stochastic. Those of you with an engineering background might have heard that the relationship between the electric power from a wind turbine and the speed of the wind is a cube relationship. So that means if the wind speed doubles, your electric power goes times 8. Of course, when the turbines are maximum speed, they have a kind of constant power. But often in countries like on mainland Europe, you have a kind of intermediate wind speeds, and then wind fluctuations have a relatively important output on the power generated. And of course, you cannot control that to a large extent. You can curtail, but you want to maximize the energy from renewables. So basically, you have there that problem. Other renewables like biogas, biomass, water are to some extent depending on the quality of what goes in to produce more or less electricity. They are to some extent controllable as well. If you take biogas, for instance, to combine it to generate both heat and power, that's a more efficient way than producing heat and power separately. Often this kind of devices produce the electricity when we need heat. It's heat driven. So basically, if we want to use the electricity to cover the electrical load, it's not in a balance. So the electricity generation gets more variable, and it's getting there when not really we are needing it for an electricity use perspective. So what does it mean from the grid? This more variable generation means that if we don't take care of that, we might have overvoltages, as we see already on some distribution grids where there's lots of PV rooftop installations. We might see higher transformer loading. We might see bidirectional energy flows which require different protection elements. And if we are not measuring them, we cannot act on them. Also there, we really need smart grids to be able to monitor them and to control them. Takeaway, if we want to get more energy from renewables, which is compliant with the vision, we cannot go without making the grid more reliable, more resilient, fit for the security of supply, also more smart. And so you can get to this point where in our research team we have been working for more or less 15 years now on demand response, which is basically on the equation between the balance between generation and supply. It's not the supply that's going to follow the demand. We also want the demand to be able to respond to different supply options. A little example graph here. In the thick orange line, it's a typical electricity consumption of an individual household. You see that the household also have solar panels, and as a result, the net exchange with the grid is following the red line. If you have to dimension this system, you look to the red line and you look to the top peak. This is the amount of kilowatts that we need, 2.5 kilowatts, and we're injecting 4 kilowatt into the grid. So we need to dimension the grid for this 4 kilowatt for that particular day. And there's simultaneity between the different users. So all the users are going to have maximum electricity generation one moment in time. So we can do some clever things with that. We can have a few appliances indicated here by these blocks, where we would be able to reduce or to shift 1 kilowatt during 1 hour from one moment to another, basically from those off-peak periods to the moment where we are producing it with the sun. And as a result of that, we're ending up with something which looks like here, where we had our red kind of capacity limits, and thanks to the use of the flexibility, the yellow boxes, we're using less of the grid, -3 and 1.8, to exchange so we can use the grid better or have a smaller grid to do the same type of thing. That's an example of the demand side, which is responding to grid issues and using the flexibility for that. And if you look into the numbers, you can see that in both situations, with and without and with demand response, you're using and generating the same amount of electricity. That doesn't change from a comfort level. You're not affected. But what you exchange with the grid, what you take from the grid, is reduced. What you inject into the grid is reduced. And your peaks, I also explained that, are reduced. So that's beneficial for the customer itself, because it's less taking energy from the grid eventually, and also from the perspective of the grid system operator, because you need less peaks. Takeaways: if we would be using that at a larger scale, we will be able to get more renewables into the grid, also at the distribution level, without having to reinforce the grid or by delaying the grid reinforcement. We will use electricity locally, which means we don't have to transport it that much, hence less losses. If we're using it to reduce the peaks, often grid costs are associated with peaks, and it's already like that for a number of industrial customers, so that will also lead to a cost saving. Of course, nobody wants to look at his electricity meter the whole day in order to have this kind of thing implemented, so you need a kind of energy management system, home energy management system, that will automatically do that for you, taking into account the different circumstances, prices, grid issues, your own production, without impacting your comfort and taking your preferences into account that you could be either green or based on luxury, having different kind of signals. And on the right-hand side, it's too small to be readable. You can see hundreds of devices that are able to do this type of thing for you. The smart meter, which is the digital meter installed by in many countries, the system operator, is also playing a role in this, but there are also lots of commercial products on the market. Making the link to the SNIPPET project, but I'm not going into details of that. Of course, you don't want that data to be used against the privacy expectations. We have been there for 15 years, I told you, on this kind of demand response. Typically from the perspective of prosumer viewpoint. Prosumer is a combination of producer and consumer of electricity and trying to use that flexibility. And happy to see as researchers, as things that we talked about 10, 15 years ago are now being put in practice and in commercial products. So that means that we need to think for the next 15 years, what are the problems? So things that we have done in the meantime and that we are looking up towards the future is we go from only electricity to electricity and heat, with the idea to go to net zero energy buildings, which basically are energy neutral on a yearly basis. And if you talk about electricity as the only carrier, no gas anymore, that means that you need to be able on a yearly basis to cover your demand with your own supply for both heating and electricity. Of course, heating has different time constants than electricity use. We're talking about the thermal inertia of a building in the orders of hours or even days if it's well insulated. So having optimization and control problems behind that have some mathematical challenges, which is interesting also for our PhD researchers. And the next step, we're going to look to positive energy districts, which are districts as a whole, combination of houses, but also some small companies or shops or whatever, which not only have individual assets per house or per building, but also a number of joint assets. And that could be joint thermal storage, joint battery storage, that could be a kind of on the rooftop of a supermarket, a PV installation for the neighborhood. And that means that they want to be energy positive, exporting energy on a yearly basis. Taking a look at all the energy carriers there, electricity and heat, and often also including transport or mobility in that picture. So that's where our current focus is on, which we'll certainly need for the next 10, 15 years. Let me talk a little bit more about this decentralization. Decentralization of generation and control. Of generation of electricity, this is clear. I've talked about having rooftop photovoltaics in many places or on a supermarket and so on. That means it's not central generation plants, big ones, lots of small ones. And if you want to run the grid, you have only a few big power plants. They can take their role in maintaining the frequency correctly. If you don't have these big power plants to take the role to make the grid stable, you need to look for new solutions in order to get there. Congestion needs to be avoided, voltage needs to be within the limits, frequency needs to be maintained, and so on. And that has to be done with these decentralized resources. Adding to that, new assets which weren't there or not there from the grid perspective, for controlling the grid perspective. Decentralized storage could be like batteries at home although in many member states in Europe it doesn't make financially sense to have photovoltaics installation combined with a battery, from a perspective at the global level and with the correct legal incentives, it does make sense and it can help support the grid. And you can also think about electric vehicles, if they are supporting vehicle to grid, so bidirectional electricity flows, then you can also use them to store electricity and even move it around from one place to another. And thermal storage plays a role as well. And then if you have that control, there's lots of challenges in order to avoid that the control algorithms are conflicting with each other. Because, for instance, in your home energy management system, you're trying to fulfill an objective to maximize your self-consumption of your locally generated electricity. But for the grid, increasing the load could be just negative. They want to decrease it. So you have two conflicting objectives which pop up if you have control algorithms running locally and at the district level and at a distribution grid level and at the central level. And so also there are quite some research challenges. And so this decentralization, I now was talking about it from a technical perspective and having those algorithms to move around packets of energy, transactive energy systems as you could call them. There's also the whole policy around it. And one of the speakers later this week is going to talk more about that. I just want to introduce that very shortly with the fourth energy package of the European Commission in 2018 called Clean Energy for All Europeans. The concept of energy communities, both citizen energy communities and renewable energy communities, have been put forward. And they allow new concepts like sharing energy among different citizens or trading it with citizens. Sharing is kind of donating it to others. Why don't I give the photovoltaic electricity from my house to my daughter who is studying elsewhere and has an electricity bill to pay? This kind of data can allow this type of transactions. It exists already, energy communities, for a longer time under different forms, often from a perspective, also a social or inclusive perspective with energy cooperatives, but it's getting a boost thanks to this European legislation, which some member states in Europe are quite slow to translate into local legislation. There are some interesting websites where you can find more information if you're interested into that. Rescope.eu, the map on the left-hand side, shows all renewable energy communities, cooperatives that have been there for a long time already. The same on the right-hand top is from Latin America. The mapa de Iniciativa de Energía Cooperativa, so the cooperation is there as well. And we also have this global observatory on peer-to-peer community and energy and transactive energy systems, which is looking into these things specifically. userstcp.org is the website. And a few more things on data. I've talked about data already a number of times. We're seeing that data becomes available everywhere, both the electrical data, the grid-related data from the smart meters, from the grid automation, from the markets that are related to that, but also about weather, about moving patterns of people, about traffic congestions and so on. And they could all be useful in having smart grid applications there. Combine that with lots of computing power that is available on the different levels, either in the cloud, where you have scalable solutions, or on the edge, in substations, at homes, and so on, where you get more and more powerful processors to do the computing, part of the computing, well, probably in a privacy-friendly way. If I make a link to the SNIPPET project, we're getting more and more compute power at home in order to not have to share the data to a central point. And you, of course, also need the communication everywhere in order to have the data move around. Could be based on the infrastructure for communication, but could also be directly device-to-device communication, as we're seeing possibly. And I'm not going into much details of that, but things like this data that is becoming available everywhere could lead to other parties using the data and getting very interesting views with the data, if it's open data, on, for instance, the CO2 intensity of the energy system. This map from electricity is for electricitymap.org, gives per country a kind of color coding, and the more green it is, the less CO2 emissions are associated with that. And we see there, for instance, France, or because of its nuclear, which is not emitting CO2, has a very low CO2 intensity of the power system, or also Scandinavia, where there's a lot of water. Belgium, where I'm from, is changing color over the day quite significantly, because often we do have a lot of wind and solar, and other moments we have to rely on the gas, so we're changing colors from green to brown. You can see that the Netherlands are a bit browner because of the gas, and there's still a lot of coal in countries like Poland and so on. But you can see how this CO2 intensity varies over a day. What are the sources producing it? You can have that consumption perspective or generation perspective and so on, all thanks to the open data and someone else using that data to make interesting applications from that. So let me make the link to a number of our research projects where we are using this data in order to have demand response and flexibility management in a number of different situations. I call this multi-objective use of flexibility. Multi-objective, we're going to use the flexibility from the demand side, residential demand as well as industrial demand, for supporting the wholesale market. The wholesale market, which was only open up to a decade ago for big players, where you needed to trade hundreds of kilowatts and hundreds of kilowatt hours, hundred thousands of, what do I say, the number of megawatt hours at least, and now this has been brought down to the range of tens of kilowatt hours to be traded. The market is organized day ahead and intraday, balancing on both kind of market objectives. We can contribute with the flexibility, but flexibility from the home is still not enough to be traded directly. You need to aggregate that, to bring that together in order to use it for such a market perspective. You can use it to support the grid locally, for instance. There are no local energy markets yet for supporting the grid. Like if there's a congestion issue, over voltage issue, currently that's not really via market being solved, but that could be possible. Or you could have your controlling algorithms intelligent and locally take that into account to support the grid and probably get rewarded for that as well eventually. And the example that I was showing a moment ago, from a prosumer perspective, you want to use it to minimize your costs, to maximize your self-consumption, and so on. The difficulty lies if you want to have a kind of multi-objective optimization, because then you need to combine these different objectives, which are often conflicting one with respect to the other. So that's why we can have quite some PhD students active on this, because there are a number of research challenges that we're gradually unraveling one by one. How to control this flexibility for multiple objectives? How can we do that in a local way or in a coordinated way? from centralized to hierarchical to completely decentralized and peer-to-peer solutions. How can we deal with the different types of uncertainty coming from user behavior, the most difficult one to predict, coming from the grid, coming from the market, coming from the weather. And how can we do that in a way which is scalable and dependable? Dependable, different aspects, both towards security, privacy, availability, and so on. And sometimes we're comparing different kind of control architectures from that, which are having very good functionality. If you go to the left, very hierarchical, straightforward, which are very bad for privacy, towards something which is a kind of combination, combining local control with some centralized information exchange and market, which is performing good from the perspective on optimality and privacy. And so if I take you a little bit through our work on that, what we're often doing is trying to capture the limits from the individual devices on the use of electricity over a particular time horizon. Your car needs to be charged by the moment you want to leave, so there's some flexibility on when to do that. You aggregate that, you do some kind of optimization to serve the markets, and then you distribute the control action to the individual devices. That's the idea where we have been starting from, and doing that in a kind of way which is very scalable by just a few signals without having to calculate an individual schedule for all of the individual cars. And it ends up then something for the aggregated flexibility where you have this curve, which are all the possible paths over time for getting to your final state. And so you find an optimum path somewhere indicated here in brown with respect to a kind of varying price, which is kind of minimizing the costs. So when the electricity is cheap, you're using more electricity. When it's more expensive, you have a flatter slope, you're using less. Which means that if you translate that into a kind of charging power to all of the cars together, for the cheaper periods, you have higher peaks. For the more expensive periods, you have lower peaks. Still, some cars need to be charged there. But then if you take a look to the grid, and we do have that peak available, that peak means that all of these cars which are connected to the grid will start charging at the same time, leading to under-voltage issues, hence a grid problem. And so what we then do, trying to take those technical constraints into account, is looking locally, so combining the local control with a distributed control. If your voltage is away from the nominal voltage, electrical engineers work in per unit, that's the nominal value. So if it's less than 90% of the nominal value, then you will decrease your charging power in order not to worsen the problem. And the standard that is mentioned there says that your voltage should be always above 85% of the nominal value, and most of the time above 90%. And so by combining that global optimization from a market with this local control in order to avoid power problems, you will serve both the market objectives and the technical objectives. Of course, that means that not all cars will be charged fully, so that peak will be lower, which is nice from a grid perspective. You will have to charge a little bit longer for all the cars to be charged. Often, if this is falling within the same price period, will not have an effect on the business case. If it would have, we did a number of simulations, it's a very small effect in practice. So that's one example of combining that market perspective for demand response with the perspective of grid support. Showing some other examples. Where batteries are becoming more and more important, not from a home perspective, but from a grid support perspective. This was some industrial PhD work that we did together with a company that is installing this kind of 1 megawatt hour battery to support the grid. And they were trying to make their business case. So first step that the PhD student did in cooperation was take a look at the different kind of value streams that you can make from such a big battery. And we were taking a look to the German market, investing the battery to use it for grid support and frequency reserve. These are a number of frequency reserve products that are on the market. Frequency containment reserve means keeping the frequency at 50 Hertz. Automatic frequency restoration reserve. After there's a drop in a frequency, you want to have an automatic recovery from that, so you can use your battery to get the grid up to speed. Manual ones, and then restoration reserves in the third set. But you can also use it for day ahead and intraday in balancing market or for some local perspectives. So we looked from grid perspective to the frequency response, not to voltage and congestion. From the perspective of the market to the different market sizes, day ahead, intraday, and imbalance. And from consumer perspective, we looked into self-consumption and avoiding the peaks. I talked about that as well. And if you look to the value on a different year based on historic data, you can see that the highest values are basically from the intraday and imbalance market. If you are able to fully predict how much imbalance there will be, which is de facto very difficult, so the actual value is quite low, the potential is a lot. What else did we learn from that study? That the most money could be made for the kind of very fast frequency containment reserve, which was typically done by the big generating plants, so can be done with batteries, and is being done in the meantime with batteries also in Belgium. But you can even make more money if you're able to combine this with, let's say, some of those consumer perspectives as well. We call that stacking the value of flexibility to make it together even stronger. Let me first give a little example of how these frequency containment reserves look like, and then how to combine them with self-consumption or with peak shaving. So this is typically how the product is defined in the market. If there is a frequency deviation, if you're away from the 50 Hertz, without a particular deadband, depending on how far we are away from the 50 Hertz, you need to respond with a higher amount of power, up to a particular level where you have the cap. So that's how the transmission system operator defines this product, and you can bid with your battery to have that service delivered, and you get remunerated for that. Of course, nobody is going to be able to predict the frequency and the frequency deviations for the next days and years, but looking towards the typical grid behavior over the last years can give you a very good view of how it typically looks like. And so we can do some stochastic analysis of that data in order to see what it typically looks like. And if this is your signal, you need with your battery power to follow the signal in order to deliver the service in this thing. Which, if you are doing that straightforward, will drain your battery if there's a kind of lower than zero average over a particular amount of time. So you can do more clever than just this. You can basically use this kind of deadband period in order to recharge the battery during that deadband period, basically keeping the state of charge more or less horizontal, while if the frequency is somewhere there in that dead zone, we're using it to recharge our battery. Which basically means that we can deliver the service not just for 24 hours, but for multiple days without having to empty the whole battery. Those of you that are interested in the mathematics behind, it's a kind of chance-constraint optimization where we're kind of defining a limit within which we don't want to cross that limit. And we do take into account that we want to get most of the money from our battery. So we take into account a battery degradation model, so that over the whole lifetime of the battery, which is defined as it is still having 80% of the initial capacity, we're able to maximize our output. Taking into account a number of practicalities, like for instance, if you have such a big 1 megawatt hour battery, you put that somewhere in a container. During winter, you have to heat it up. During summer, you have to cool it down. So you have to include also HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning into that picture. And then we can use some heuristics to get there. And that allowed to make, for different kind of sizing of the battery and different assumptions of the price of electricity, a positive business case for doing only that frequency containment reserve for a battery in the order of magnitude 1 megawatt hour. That means that's a 1C battery. The ratio between the power and the energy is 1. And the maximum present value is the top point of the curve, makes over the whole lifetime of that product quite some money, which made the company decide on going that way. But the company also found out that, and the PhD student, that we can make more money from that perspective. The kind of signal, they have 10 minutes. Thanks for that. Let's take another use case. Look to the picture at the top. It's a little home where you have your photovoltaic installation, and you also have a battery, 10 kilowatt hours, 7 kilowatt home battery. Typical consumption profiles, these zones that you are seeing here over one day, fluctuate from one day to another. If you don't have a battery at all, for some general data time series that we took, you're consuming per day about 6 kilowatt hours, injecting 10 or 11 kilowatt hours, so it costs you a little bit of money if you're assuming that you get paid for injecting into the grid, kind of feed-in tariff. I think the assumption was 12 cents per kilowatt hour, and for buying it, it was 25 cents per kilowatt hour. If you add to that the self-consumption, the picture that I showed in the beginning for explaining demand response, you want to reduce your injection into the grid when you're generating yourself by shifting a bit of your consumption towards the day. That makes that a total, you're not really needing the grid anymore, and you're still injecting a bit, so you get paid, which brings a kind of value per day of a bit of €1. But in order to just do that self-consumption, you're basically only consuming a part of the grid of the battery capacity. And that's shown there as state of charge. It's shown here as the battery power, which is these black two lines. Which means that you do have a lot of spare capacity available for providing other services, for doing frequency control, so getting it aggregated from different customers together to support the grid, much more beneficial. This goes from 0.8 to 2.4 euros per day. So making much more money with frequency control than with self-consumption. And behind that, what we did was a kind of dynamic optimization to identify how much of the battery we will need to do the self-consumption, how much we will be able to support the grid with for frequency containment reserve, And that changes from one day to the other, if you're able to predict that. So it's a kind of dynamic optimization that you do for that in more detail. So that's combining value stacking, the frequency containment reserve, with self-consumption. But the question is how to determine those boundaries, basically, what to do with the self-consumption, what to do with the frequency containment reserves. Chance constraint optimization is behind that, and then defining a certain epsilon value and doing robust optimization with respect to those assumptions, which is basically defining those boundaries both in state of charge as well as in battery power. Identifying a kind of typical uncertainty sets, depending on where you put your value of alpha there. And the final example of combining two functionalities is this peak shaving. Industrial customers often pay according to the peaks, and in many member states in Europe, also individual customers are going to do that. If you have a customer with two sites, and this is a bigger battery, both have a 1 megawatt hour battery on two sites, you can take into account the battery for minimizing the peak, and the peak in this kind of schemes is defined as the maximum peak during 1 month, and using the rest of the capacity of the battery for having that frequency containment reserves, frequency control directly, because we have 1 megawatt available. Combining that from the two sides together for frequency containment reserves and avoiding the peaks together allows you to dynamically split the capacity of both batteries, a part in red to reduce the peaks, a part in orange to contribute to the frequency containment reserve. Same with blue and cyan for the second together. And you can see that if you combine these two batteries, the light orange and the light blue together, you have a constant service that you can put on the market in order to provide frequency containment reserves, which was making most of the money. But of course, mathematics behind, it's a bit difficult because you have to take a look at what is the highest peak up to now for this month, the cost for the monthly peak consumption over a 31-day period. You have to take into account, so you're using kind of dynamic programming techniques, while this frequency containment reserves are auctioned daily in different markets. So you have to do dynamic programming to get to these optimal values. I could also go into more details on data-driven modeling and control, but I made this section short because I knew I would be coming to the end of my 1-hour talk. Having some examples, and we can talk more about that during the different breaks. We're here the whole week together. We're working on different kind of machine learning approaches, reinforcement learning for scheduling electric vehicles together. So we want to learn what is a typical market price combined with fleet availability. Looking at individual devices like electric boilers. You know that if you have an electric boiler with hot water inside, due to the physics, there's a kind of cold and warm part, and that's if you're measuring the temperature at one location, it's not always representative for the whole state of charge of the system, and you don't want the people to get a cold shower at the end of the day. So you need to learn basically how much hot water is into such a boiler, and you want to heat up the boiler if you have a varying price profile, like here this red line, that it basically needs to heat up when prices are low and when the state of charge of the boiler is also low, so that people get a hot shower when they want it to do. And so with reinforcement learning, it's kind of technique in machine learning that you try out some actions and get a kind of reward. If they are successful, you're able to get there. Other things that we're doing there is looking also at transfer learning, and we have a very nice review paper on that, on the different overviews of where to use transfer learning from. that means basically training your machine learning algorithm in a kind of simulation environment to let it run in the real world, so to get rid of the long learning period in the beginning. We also talked, I have a kind of difficult question. Is it best to hire a power system engineer and let them train about data science, or have a data scientist and let them learn about power systems? But we want to combine both knowledges together in order to get there. And we're looking at training, or starting from the physics and adding their data to that, or starting from the data and adding their domain knowledge to that. And basically, both things have proven successful and are able to improve or outperform the two other ones. Let me come to the looking forward. We're not there yet with the decentralized control of flexibility. Still have, for the moment, 9 PhD students, and they're all interesting work on different type of things. Some keywords. We are focusing on the energy service. We don't care whether the heating is from one source or another, renewable through electricity via a heat pump, or from a heat network, thermal network in the street. We want to have a comfortable temperature at home. So we're looking to the energy service over the different energy carriers, multi-carrier energy systems. And with the different time constants, that's a challenge. With the different physics, that's a challenge. With the different datas, that's a challenge. But if you look to the multi-carrier system, you can also go from one carrier to the other. You can convert electricity into heat. You can convert it into storage, into hot water, from the perspective. So there is this power to X and X to power possibilities, which is bringing to the design space and to the optimization problem a number of difficult additions, because the uncertainty, as you would call it, is to the power of n, becoming much more difficult. And the data is becoming more and more available. We still see that most of the data that is around in the smart energy systems is there without ever being used, or only a little bit in aggregated form. So we're looking at where can we use it for modeling, for control, for optimization, combined with the first principles models from physics. And we still want to investigate further how to do that in a completely decentralized way, or what's an optimal combination of local and centralized control, hierarchical ones, so that you have all these running algorithms not conflicting with each other, at least ignoring each other, and hopefully cooperating among each other. I ask my students sometimes the hypothetical question. Currently, it's a system operator that runs the power system. Would you be able to design such an autonomous system without the system operator still performing well? Coming back to my title, I think at European level, the direction is clear for a long period, more than 25 years. At the level of different member states, we can improve a lot. There's often inconsistency among policies. There's often a vision which changes from one term of office to the next, or even within one term of office, with some over-subsidies to one technology and not into the grid, and so on, with lots of uncertainties about the investment climate, with data that is kept for confidential reasons within companies and not shared, little open data, markets that are getting harder. So that's a negative view on how it's implemented in the different member states from the policy perspective, but I see an enormous positive view by let's say you, researchers, the youth, the energy communities, the young people, the entrepreneurs that want to make the best out of the new smart energy market. And I think that's the way we need to go for. We want to have smart energy systems, and they will make up a better world. It will be more sustainable, more comfortable, it will lead to more economic impact, and I think we will have more fun, but we all need your contribution for that. Thank you. If you are sharing this information with the colleagues, it's also being recorded. I'm just going to flash 3 slides or 4 slides. If you want to delve into the detailed work, you can look it up afterwards. On the different aspects, on scalability, on decentralization, on machine learning, on grids and grid integration of buildings, on dependability, privacy, and cybersecurity. I'm willing to take any questions.